The President's Cabinet at work. The President's Cabinet. The President's Cabinet is not a medicine cabinet in which he or she would go to find some ibuprofen, say, for a headache, but rather it's a committee. It's an informal advisory board that the President has brought together by custom. That is, it's become customary to assemble people in a committee form that would help keep you informed, advise you on decisions, and help you make those decisions. In fact, the Constitution does not make any mention of it whatsoever. The President's Cabinet. Just exactly who, you might be asking, is in this cabinet if it's not ibuprofen? And that would be the heads or leaders of the 15 executive departments. In fact, the 15 executive departments complete much of the federal government's work. That is, it is not done by the President alone, but rather a bureaucracy of many different departments and agencies that get the government's work done. The framers, in fact, spent little time organizing the executive branch. So over time, Congress, by necessity, has created, combined, and abolished departments as needed and as the federal government's workload has changed. For example, following the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks on our homeland, we have established a new department. So from that terrorist act, our government grew, in which a new executive department was created. And so now we have this 15th executive department. The first three departments that we'll see here in a moment to be created were created kind of from the beginning in 1789. And then so from 3 now we have 15. Because you see, as government and society changes, the needs of the people change. So after, say, the terrorist attacks on 9/11, we have now this department that deals with terrorism and being protected domestically and internationally with threats. That could be border, it could be all kinds of things. Cabinet members are appointed by the President. So you're thinking, how does one become a cabinet member? You are selected by the President, and the Senate must approve you. By and large, the Senate does approve all appointments the President makes. There's only a handful that have been rejected by the President. Now, what are some things that the President would use to choose cabinet members? Some characteristics, if you will. One is party. So, for instance, if the President is of the Democratic Party, he or she might choose somebody from that particular political party because they share the same ideology and beliefs. Gender and race are taken into consideration too. It is nice to have a diverse group of people in the cabinet, and so that does weigh into the decision somewhat. And lastly, management abilities and also experience. So, for instance, if I were to be chosen to serve on the President's cabinet, the most likely choice for my experience would be within the Department of Education. I wouldn't lead up the Department of Defense because I have never served a day in the military. So it depends on your background and your experience and kind of your area of expertise, and also how well do you manage tasks and other people. Now, with each executive department, there are leaders of each, and we call these people secretaries, except for the Department of Justice, which we would call the Attorney General. And so each of these secretaries and the Attorney General serve in the President's cabinet, along with some other top White House officials, like the White House Chief of Staff and the Counselor to the President, among some other people. When you do your web online exploring the executive branch activity, you will kind of explore the President's cabinet, the names of the people and the titles of which they serve on the President's cabinet. Each department is a large group that is divided into units and subunits. There are aides, there are assistants, there are different specialties such as personnel and legal advice and budgeting. So each department can be pretty large and is divided further. So it's not just one maybe small group of people, but a large network of people that would work to get the president's jobs done. Most of these people that work in these executive departments are career people. They're not politicians. So they work as civilians and employees of the federal government, and they are usually stationed outside of Washington, D.C. So it's somewhat a separation of the politicians and the workers of the government. Now let's look at specific. I'm going to highlight for you 6 of the 15, and then when you do your web quest for exploring the White House, you'll do the other 9. We have Department of State, led by Secretary John Kerry. Department of the Treasury, led by Secretary Jack Lew. Department of Defense, led by Secretary Ashton Carter. Department of Health and Human Services, led by Secretary Sylvia Matthews Burwell. Department of Education, led by Secretary Arne Duncan. And Homeland Security, led by Secretary Jeh Johnson. Let's go into each quickly. These particular departments, and let's start with the State, Department of State, which is the oldest and was established in 1789, has the most prestige, and this one is also the smallest, led by Secretary John Kerry. This department, and led by Secretary John Kerry, he would advise the president on foreign policy and help with negotiation of policies with foreign countries. The leader of this department would also represent the nation abroad and in international organizations when maybe the president is absent. So you should have established in that column 1789 a few responsibilities. Again, you could use maybe keywords like we usually do, and phrases. And then agencies, there are a few in parentheses for each as we go through these, and you maybe write down 1. Department of the Treasury was established also. This is the second of the first 3 in 1789, led by Secretary Jack Lew. And if you think about what that word treasury means, it means money. And so we have lots of things in this department that deal with money, including the United States Mint, which produces and coins bills. Collecting taxes, borrowing money, debt. If you've ever heard of the ATF, enforces the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms laws. If you've ever seen the guys with the navy blue jackets and ATF on the back in yellow, that falls under this department because it deals with lots of money. Also, the IRS, Internal Revenue Service, is one of the important agencies. So when you file your income taxes, you mail them in or you shoot them electronically over to the IRS, and they look through it and decide if you figured everything correctly. Next, the first 3 executive departments, Department of Defense, which happens to be the largest and established in 1789 with the other 2, led by Secretary Ashton Carter, provides military forces to deter war and protect the nation's security. So, when you think about defense, you think about military, and here we have some important agencies, Department of Army, Navy, Air Force. You see those, you write down 1. Excellent, very good. Let's move on. Department of Health and Human Services, which has the largest budget of the departments at 25% of all federal spending each year, established in 1953, led by Sylvia Matthews Burwell. Under the Department of Health and Human Services, many things that have to do with our health and well-being, including health care, conducting programs to control diseases, pure food and drug laws that help us with the consumption of food and drugs and making sure that those are, safe for us to consume. It's never reassuring for us, when you see those commercials on TV and they talk about a certain drug and they say, may cause irregular heartbeat and strokes and clots, blood clots and all sorts of stuff, and even death, seizures. We tend to think, oh my gosh, wow, that's scary. And while that is super important to know, also know that as they test these drugs, if one person experiences, out of 1,000, a particular symptom, they have to report it. So also keep that in mind too. And they report to you probably the most common and maybe most severe, but still important nonetheless. Also, Department of Health and Human Services administers Medicare and Medicaid. The CDC, as you can see below, you could abbreviate that if you want to use the acronym CDC. That would be perfectly fine. They help with, keeping the Ebola. The CDC got involved with that when we saw that last year. We had the CDC step in and kind of work to help control that, establish procedures and routines for hospitals and doctors and nurses, and inform the public, and all sorts of things. Department of Education was established in 1979, so fairly recently in the grand scheme of things, certainly not 1789. Led by Secretary Arne Duncan, and this has to do with schools and so forth, so and money to schools, conducting educational research, the No Child Left Behind, Common Core, some of those things are kind of born out of this Department of Education, so overseeing the schooling of our children and assessing how well they're learning and how much they know. And then also we look at this in comparison to other countries internationally. And last but not least, the Department of Homeland Security, which is our newest. This is our baby of all the departments, established in 2002, led by Jeh Johnson. And so you see here, we've got that border control, transportation security, so that would be with the Coast Guard, emergency preparedness. Some of this stuff wasn't brand new in 2002, but when we started this executive branch, some of this stuff was kind of jockeyed around from department to department. Oh, this fits better with Homeland Security, so let's move Secret Service and Coast Guard, which were not brand new in 2002, but let's move them under Department of Homeland Security because that kind of fits it better. Chemical, biological, and radiological and nuclear defense, and then informing with analysis and infrastructure protection. So we look at immigration, we look at protection, we look at all those things within the Department of Homeland Security. It's become a very important department in our executive branch, even though it is the baby, the newest. And that completes the lesson for the executive department. And the cabinet, the president's cabinet.